Tonight, we're going somewhere unusual. We're going to explore one of the oldest, strangest, most misunderstood ideas in all of human philosophy. An idea so simple, it sounds like a joke. An idea so deep, it still hasn't been solved. The art of doing nothing. Not laziness, not apathy, not giving up. Something far more subtle, far more difficult, and, if we follow it honestly, far more dangerous than it first appears. Let your body rest, let your mind slow down, let your breath find its own rhythm. Because tonight we're going to sit with a question that a man asked over 2,000 years ago in a land torn apart by war. And we're going to see how that question still hasn't let go of us. The question is this: what if everything you've been taught about action, about trying, about pushing, is exactly what's keeping you from what you want? And then much later tonight, we're going to ask the darker question underneath that one. The one nobody wants to ask: what if doing nothing is sometimes the most evil thing a person can do? But we'll get there slowly. For now, just breathe. We have all night. Somewhere along the way, someone told you that effort is virtue. Maybe it was a parent, maybe a teacher, maybe the culture itself. That invisible river of assumptions we swim in from birth. Work harder, try more, push through. Don't stop. Sleep when you're dead. And there's something inside most of us that believed it. Because effort feels moral. It feels responsible. When you're trying, when you're striving, you can at least tell yourself you're doing something right. But have you ever noticed something strange? The moments in your life when things came together, when the conversation flowed, when the work felt easy, when you found the answer, when you fell in love, those moments almost never came from trying harder. They came from somewhere else, from some state you slipped into without meaning to. A runner describes it as being in the zone. A musician talks about the moment the music starts playing through her rather than by her. A writer says, the best sentences arrive as if from nowhere, and the ones he tries to construct always sound hollow. A mother, holding her child for the first time, doesn't think about how to love. It just happens. The ancient Chinese had a word for this. Wu Wei. 2 characters, 2 syllables. A concept that has occupied some of the greatest minds in history for over 2,500 years. Wu, meaning, without doing, without striving, without forcing. Wei, meaning, action, intention. Effort, Wu Wei, effortless action. Non-doing, the action of non-action. On the surface, it sounds like an excuse to do nothing. Like a philosophy invented by someone who wanted to stay in bed. But the Taoists, the people who gave us this idea, were not lazy dreamers. They were some of the most careful observers of nature and human behavior who ever lived. And what they noticed over centuries of watching how water moves, how trees grow, how empires rise and fall, how people succeed and destroy themselves, was something deeply counterintuitive. The hardest things in nature are not accomplished by force, they are accomplished by yielding. Water, for example, does not attack the rock, it goes around it, and then through it, and one day the rock is gone, and the water is still there. We'll come back to water. It's the central metaphor of Taoism, because water, the Taoists believed, is the closest thing we have to a visible demonstration of the Tao itself. But first, let's meet the man who wrote it all down. The story goes like this. In the 6th century before the Common Era, though historians argue about the exact dates, and some argue about whether he existed at all, there was an old man. His name, or the name we remember him by, was Laozi, which translates simply as the Old Master. He worked as a librarian in the royal archives of the Zhou dynasty, a quiet man, a keeper of records, someone who, day after day, watched the kings and lords and generals of his age argue and scheme and wage wars and build empires and watch them crumble. The Zhou dynasty was in decline. China was fragmenting. What would later be called the Warring States period was approaching. Centuries of almost constant conflict, of lords competing for dominance, of cities burned and rivers running red. And Laozi, the old librarian, looked at all of it and decided to leave. The story says he climbed on a water buffalo and headed west, toward the mountains, to live as a hermit and die in peace. But at the gate of the city, a guard named Dian Shi recognized him as a wise man, perhaps the wisest man in the kingdom, and begged him not to leave without writing something down. And so Laozi stopped, and in one sitting, or so the legend says, he wrote 81 short poems, 5,000 characters in ancient Chinese. He handed them to the guard, and then he walked into the mountains and was never seen again. Those 81 poems became the Tao Te Ching, the Book of the Way and its virtue, one of the most translated texts in all of human history, second only to the Bible. And at its center, woven through nearly every verse, is the concept of Wu Wei. Now here's what's important to understand about the world Laozi was watching. China in the 6th century BCE was a place where everyone was doing more. More armies, more laws, more rituals, more intervention. Every king believed the problem with his kingdom was that he wasn't applying enough force. More taxation, more control, more punishments, more ceremonies to keep the people in line. And Laozi looked at this frantic, exhausting, violent activity and wrote, "The Tao does nothing, and yet nothing remains undone." Imagine the reaction. Here is a world on fire. Here are kings and generals and philosophers all arguing about how to fix it, how to act, how to govern, how to command, how to change things. And this old man climbs on a buffalo and says, the answer is to stop doing. Was he a fool? Was he a genius? Was he both? The Tao Te Ching does not offer easy answers. It does not argue. It does not explain. It circles its subject like water circles a stone. It approaches from different angles. It contradicts itself deliberately because it knows that the thing it's pointing at cannot be captured in words. Verse 1 begins, "The Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao." The first sentence of the entire book is a warning that the book itself cannot tell you what the book is about. This is either madness or profound humility, maybe both. What is the Tao? Translated as the way, it is not a god, not a force in the Western sense, not fate, exactly. It is the underlying pattern of everything, the rhythm of the universe before humans arrived to name and categorize and fight over it. It is what happens when nothing interferes. The seasons turn without anyone pushing them. A seed becomes a tree without trying. Stars burn and die on their own schedules. Rivers find the sea without a map. The Tao is what's already happening. And Wu Wei is the practice of not getting in the way. It sounds simple. It is not simple at all. Laozi was obsessed with water. In a book of 81 poems, he returns to water again and again. And when you think about it, it's strange. Water is ordinary. Water is everywhere. Water is something you walk past without thinking. But Laozi saw in water something that no political theory, no military strategy, no moral philosophy could replicate. He saw intelligence without intention. Verse 8 of the Tao Te Ching says, "The highest good is like water. Water benefits 10,000 things and does not compete. It dwells in places people reject. Let that settle. Water does not compete." This is a radical statement in a world, then and now, built around competition, around who has more, who wins, who dominates. But water never competes. Water never argues about where it should go. Water never forces its way through a wall. Water simply finds the lowest place, the place no one wants, the crack in the stone, the hollow in the ground, the underside of the world. And because of this, because water never fights, water cannot be defeated. Think about what this means. If you try to cup water with a knife, the water closes behind the blade. If you try to punch it, your fist passes through. If you dam it, it waits patiently until something shifts, and then it moves again. Water has no ego. Water has no investment in being water. And because water has no ego to defend, it is invincible. Lao Tzu writes, "Nothing in the world is as soft and yielding as water, yet for dissolving the hard and inflexible, nothing can surpass it." This is the core of Wu Wei. Not passivity, not surrender, not indifference, but a kind of intelligence that does not announce itself, that does not fight the shape of reality, that simply moves with what is. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Because so far, Wu Wei sounds beautiful. It sounds restful. It sounds restful. It sounds like exactly the philosophy you'd want to fall asleep to. But Lao Tzu was not writing a philosophy of comfort. He was writing a philosophy of power. And the Taoists who followed him were not gentle, passive dreamers. Some of the most effective rulers in Chinese history governed by the principles of Wu Wei. The early Han Dynasty in the 2nd century BCE adopted a form of Taoist governance called Huanglao, and for several decades under this philosophy, the philosophy of not interfering, of reducing taxation, of letting people find their own way, China experienced one of its greatest periods of peace and prosperity. The emperor sat on his throne and did very little, and everything flourished. This is Wu Wei as political philosophy, the sage ruler who governs by not governing, who leads by not leading, who shapes by not forcing. But then comes the question that the emperors eventually asked, that any serious thinker eventually has to ask. What about when things go wrong? What about when evil enters the space that you've left open? What do you do then? And here, right here, is where the philosophy gets dark. Let's sit with something uncomfortable for a moment. Not so uncomfortable that you need to get up. Stay where you are. Let your body stay heavy and warm. But let your mind go somewhere most people avoid. The philosophy of Wu Wei tells you to stop forcing, to stop imposing your will, to stop fighting the natural course of things, to yield, to be like water, to do nothing unnecessary. But what counts as unnecessary? Here is a question that has no comfortable answer. Imagine you are a leader, a king, a president, a parent, anyone with the ability to act or to withhold action. Something bad is happening, not to you, to someone else. It is in some sense none of your business. The natural course of events, if left alone, will allow this bad thing to continue. You could intervene, but intervention is force. Intervention is ego. Intervention is deciding that your judgment about what should happen is more important than the Tao's natural unfolding. So you practice Wu Wei. You do nothing, and the bad thing happens. Are you innocent? Is your non-action the highest wisdom, or the most sophisticated form of cowardice ever invented? This question is not hypothetical. It has played out across all of human history. The German philosopher Hannah Arendt called it the banality of evil, the idea that the greatest atrocities in history were not carried out only by monsters, but by ordinary people who simply didn't act, who stood aside, who told themselves it wasn't their business, who let the natural course of events unfold. Was that Wu Wei, or was that something else wearing Wu Wei's clothes? Lao Tzu himself seems to have felt this tension. In the Tao Te Ching, he doesn't tell us to be passive in the face of suffering. He tells us to act without ego, to act without forcing, to act without desire for outcome. There is a crucial difference between I am not acting because I trust the natural unfolding of the Tao, and I am not acting because acting is difficult and uncomfortable and might cost me something. One of these is wisdom. One of these is moral failure dressed as wisdom. And from the outside, and often from the inside, they look exactly the same. This is one of the great problems of Taoist philosophy. And not just Taoist. Every tradition that values equanimity, acceptance, non-attachment, Buddhism, Stoicism, certain strands of Christianity, every one of them eventually runs into this wall. Where does peace end and complicity begin? The Stoics had a concept called the dichotomy of control. Things within your control, your thoughts, your actions, your reactions. Things outside your control, everything else. The Stoics said, focus only on what you can control and accept everything else with equanimity. Beautiful, useful, genuinely liberating in many situations. But what about the things that are within your control and that you choose not to act on? What about the help you could give but don't? The voice you could raise but don't? Is that the Stoic ideal of peace? Or is it just a philosophical excuse for inaction? ZHUANGZI, the second great philosopher of Taoism, and we'll meet him properly in a moment, told a story the butcher worked with a knife for 19 years without dulling the blade, not because he cut less, but because he cut perfectly. He found the spaces between bones, the natural gaps in the animal's body, and his knife moved through them without resistance. He wasn't forcing, he wasn't grinding against solid matter. He was doing exactly what needed to be done, but doing it in alignment with the structure of things. This is Wu Wei, not the absence of action, but action so perfectly aligned with reality that it leaves no unnecessary damage. How do you know when you're the master butcher and when you're just someone who doesn't want to pick up the knife? I don't have a clean answer. The absence of a clean answer is the point. About 2 centuries after Laozi climbed onto his buffalo and disappeared, another philosopher arrived. His name was ZHUANGZI, and he went by the title ZHUANGZI, Master Zhuang. If Laozi was the poet of Taoism, mystical, sparse, ancient, then ZHUANGZI was its storyteller, its comedian, its radical. Where Laozi spoke in images and paradoxes, ZHUANGZI wrote stories. Strange, funny, disturbing, beautiful stories that approached the Tao from sideways angles, through humor and absurdity, and arrived at conclusions that felt like the floor dropping out from under your feet. The most famous is very short. It takes about 30 seconds to read, and some people spend their whole lives thinking about it. Here it is. Once upon a time, I, ZHUANGZI, dreamt I was a butterfly, fluttering hither and thither. To all intents and purposes, a butterfly. I was conscious only of my happiness as a butterfly, unaware that I was ZHUANGZI. Soon I awaked, and there I lay, myself again. Now I do not know whether I was then a man dreaming I was a butterfly, or whether I am now a butterfly dreaming I am a man. That's it. That's the whole story. And you might read it and think, yes, that's charming. That's a nice metaphor for the fluid nature of consciousness. I understand what he's saying, but I want you to stay with it a little longer. Because ZHUANGZI wasn't making a cute observation about dreams. He was doing something far more destabilizing. He was questioning whether the self you believe in, the stable, continuous you who wakes up every morning and knows who you are and what you want and what matters, is as solid as it feels. What if what you call you is just a particular pattern that happens to be running right now? What if consciousness is not a thing that happens to the universe, but something the universe does in 1,000 different forms, and the form you happen to be running in, the human form, the you form, is just one of them? This sounds mystical. Maybe it is. But neuroscience has been creeping towards something similar for decades. The self, as neuroscientists increasingly understand it, is not a fixed entity in the brain. It's a narrative, a story your brain tells about itself every moment to create the sense of continuity. You are not a noun, you are a verb, you are an ongoing process. And if that's true, if the self is not a fixed thing but a continuous unfolding, then Wu Wei starts to look different. Because if there is no fixed you who needs to impose its will on the world, if you are already part of the flow of things, not separate from it, then forcing is not just ineffective. It is, in some deep sense, mistaken. It is the butterfly who insists he is definitely a man and not a butterfly. and therefore cannot move through the air. The tragedy, in Zhuangzi's view, is not that humans suffer. The tragedy is that we suffer unnecessarily, that we fight the river instead of swimming in it, that we grip so tightly to the idea of who we are, what we want, what we deserve, that we can't feel the current at all. And yet, Zhuangzi himself had an extraordinary life. He was offered powerful government positions and turned them down. He argued with princes. He challenged the orthodoxies of his day with ferocious intelligence. He was not passive. He was engaged, just without the ego that needed to win. There's something there, something that takes a long time to understand. You can care deeply about something without needing it to turn out a specific way. You can act with everything you have and release the outcome. You can be fully present without being fully in control. That is not resignation. That is the highest form of freedom. Let's go back to the question of power, because Taoism, despite its reputation as a philosophy of quiet hermits, has always had a deep and complicated relationship with power. Laozi wrote for rulers. Much of the Tao Te Ching is addressed directly to kings. And the image of the ideal ruler that Laozi paints is one of the strangest in all of political philosophy. The great ruler, says Laozi, is the one whose subjects barely know he exists. When the best leader's work is done, the people say, "We did it ourselves." Think about what this asks of someone who holds power. In most political traditions, Western, Eastern, ancient, modern leadership is understood as visible action. The leader who acts, who speaks, who commands, who builds, who conquers. The leader who leaves their mark on things. Laozi inverts all of this. The best leader leaves no mark. The best leader creates the conditions in which people flourish and then steps back. The best leader governs as water governs, by finding the lowest place, by not competing, by not imposing. And historically, here's the fascinating part, there's evidence this works. The Honglao period of early Han Dynasty China, in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, was a genuine experiment in Taoist governance. After the violent, exhausting campaigns that ended the Qin dynasty and unified China under Han rule, the first Han emperors adopted a philosophy of near-total non-intervention. They dramatically reduced taxation. They stopped ambitious construction projects. They withdrew the state from most aspects of daily life. And China, exhausted, broken, starving from years of war, slowly recovered. The population grew, agriculture flourished, commerce revived, the empire stabilized. The emperors did very little. And things got better. Now, a skeptic would say, that's not because of Wu Wei. That's because any empire that stops fighting wars and taxing people into poverty will eventually recover. The Taoism is just the philosophy that happened to be present, maybe. But the Taoists would say, that's exactly the point. The wisdom was in knowing when not to act, in having the restraint, when the empire finally won, not to immediately start building new monuments to their glory and launching new campaigns of conquest. The wisdom was in the pause. And then, inevitably, the Wu Wei period ended. A new emperor came, an ambitious emperor, an emperor who wanted to do things, expand the empire, build the Great Wall further, dominate the northern steppes. Emperor Wu of Han, the martial emperor, one of the most successful expansionists in Chinese history. He replaced the Taoist ministers with Confucian ones. He began to govern by action, by effort, by force of will, and in his reign, China became one of the great powers of the ancient world. So, which was better? The Taoist period of quiet recovery, or the Confucian period of explosive expansion? Was one right and one wrong, or were they both right in their time? Is it possible that Wu Wei is not a permanent philosophy, but a kind of wisdom that knows when to act and when not to, and the wisdom is in reading which moment you're in? Lao Tzu would probably say, yes, exactly. That's what I was trying to tell you. But then the question becomes, how do you know which moment you're in? And this is where the philosophy becomes personal, where it stops being about emperors and water buffalo and old men at gates, and becomes about you, lying here in the quiet, right now. We live in a world that is allergic to rest. I don't mean sleep, exactly wrong though, sleep is undervalued too. I mean the deeper rest, the willingness to not be doing something, the capacity to let a problem sit without attacking it, the ability to be still while something unfolds. This is almost structurally impossible in the modern world. We have phones that vibrate with urgency every few minutes. We have economies built on the premise that a person's value is measured by their output. We have cultures, many of them that have built Protestant work ethic or Confucian diligence ethics so deep into their foundations that rest itself feels like moral failure. In American English, we talk about being productive with our time, as if time were a factory floor, as if you are here to produce. And yet most of the great breakthroughs in human history, in science, in art, in relationships, in personal transformation, did not come from more effort. They came from a pause. Darwin famously spent years doing almost nothing visible, taking long walks lying in his garden, staring at worms, while his theory of evolution assembled itself somewhere below the surface of conscious thought. Newton's apple, apocryphal as it probably is, captures something true. The insight came while he was resting under a tree, not while he was pushing. Archimedes stepped into a bath. The pattern repeats across centuries, across cultures, across fields. The insight does not come when you force it. It comes when you stop for. The Japanese have a term, Vida Mushin, no mind. It's a state cultivated in martial arts where the practitioner is so present, so empty of deliberate thought, that the body responds to threats faster than conscious decision-making could ever allow. The master swordsman doesn't think about where to cut. He just cuts. This is the same as Wu Wei, the same discovery, arrived at independently, in a different culture, in a different context. When you stop trying to act and simply act something faster and more accurate, then your thinking mind takes over. Athletes call it the zone. Psychologist Mihaly called it flow. ZHUANGZI called it flow. ZHUANGZI called it Wei, the Tao moving through you. But here's the modern trap. In our culture, Wu Wei has been domesticated, monetized, turned into a productivity hack. You'll find it in self-help books, in CEO interviews, in morning routine videos. I meditate for 20 minutes in the morning, which makes me 30% more productive in the afternoon. I take a 30-minute walk, which gives me my best ideas. The non-doing becomes a tool in service of more doing. And this is Vra. The Taoists would say Vra exactly backwards. The point of Wu Wei is not to do nothing so that you can later do more. The point is to stop treating doing as the measure of everything. The point is to question the assumption that your value of Daya, your worth, your meaning, your rightness in the universe of Daya is connected to what you produce. What if you produced nothing today? What if today you simply existed? You breathed, you felt the weight of your body, you watched the light change, you let thoughts come and go without grabbing any of them. Would that be a wasted day? Every culture in history, except our modern one, would probably say no. The Taoists would say, that might have been the most profound day you've ever lived. Because in that stillness, in the absence of agenda, you might have felt something that's very hard to feel when you're busy. The Tao, the current that's already moving, the river you're already in, and you might have realized that you don't need to swim so hard, that the river already knows where it's going. There is a verse in the Tao Te Ching, verse 6, that has troubled translators and philosophers for centuries. The valley spirit never dies. It is called the mysterious female. The gateway of the mysterious female is called the root of heaven and earth. Dimly visible, it seems as if it were there. Yet use will never drain it. End quote. The valley spirit, what a strange phrase. A valley is nothing. A valley is the space between hills. It is defined by absence, not by presence. The valley is where the mountains are not. And yet, what fills the valley? The river runs through valleys. Rain collects in valleys. Life gathers in valleys. Cities are built in valleys, not on mountaintops. Because the valley is where water goes, where shelter is, where the soil is richest. The valley is nothing, and yet the valley sustains everything. This is what Laozi is pointing at with Wu Wei, the usefulness of emptiness. He says it more plainly in verse 11. 30 spokes share one hub. It is the hole in the center that makes the wheel useful. Clay is fashioned into a pot. It is the hollow space that makes the pot useful. Doors and windows are cut into walls. It is the empty spaces that make the room useful. Therefore, what is present gives us benefit. But it is the absence that makes it useful. What is present gives us benefit. But it is the absence that makes it useful. The cup is useful because it is empty. The wheel is useful because of its hole. The room is useful because of its space. And you, with all your ideas and achievements and knowledge and skills and opinions and plans, are you useful? Or are you so full that nothing new can enter? This is Wu Wei, a spiritual practice, not the emptiness of depression or defeat or giving up, but the cultivated emptiness, the practiced spaciousness, the deliberate not filling of every silence with words, every moment with tasks, every uncertainty with answers. The valley spirit never dies, because a valley cannot be killed. You can destroy a mountain, but you can't destroy the absence of a mountain. Laozi calls this the mysterious female, the yin principle, the receptive, the yielding, the dark, the potential. In Taoism, this is not less than the active masculine yang principle. It is its complement, its necessary other half. The world we have built tilts almost entirely toward yang, action, light, force, expansion, progress. And Laozi's warning, issued 2,500 years ago, was that a world built entirely on yang would devour itself. Because without receptivity, there is no place for anything new to grow. Because without darkness, there is no rest. Because without the valley, the mountains are just isolated peaks, cut off from water, cut off from life, cold and alone. Look at the world tonight. Look at the speed of it, the noise of it, the constant production, the breathlessness, and ask yourself, quietly, honestly, with no agenda, is there a valley in your life? Where good and evil live. Now, here is the question we've been circling all night. Let's look at it directly. If Wu Wei is the highest wisdom, if non-action, non-forcing, going with the flow of things is the ultimate virtue, then what do we do with evil? What do we do with the suffering that a human being could stop but doesn't? What do we do with the warlord who practices Wu Wei by simply not interfering as his army burns a village? What do we do with the bystander who practices Wu Wei by not speaking up? What do we do with the comfortable, with the privileged, with the powerful, who find in Taoism a philosophical framework that happens to perfectly justify their existing comfort, their existing privilege, their existing unwillingness to act? Here's the uncomfortable truth that Laozi's philosophy does not fully resolve. Wu Wei requires moral clarity before it can be used wisely. You have to know what you're choosing not to do, and why. There is a version of Wu Wei that is genuine, that comes from someone who has sat with the question, who has felt the pull toward action, who has honestly assessed whether their action would help or harm, who has genuinely surrendered their need to feel important, to feel like a hero, and who has, from that place of clarity, chosen not to act. This is rare. This is genuinely difficult. This requires more self-awareness than most people ever develop. And then there is the other version, the version that has never seriously engaged with the question, that has not sat with the discomfort, that has not felt the pull, because it has learned not to feel anything that asks too much of it. The version that discovered at some point that there was a philosophy that told it not to force things, and took a long relieved breath and said, finally, permission. Laozi almost certainly knew about this second version. He was a librarian. He had watched centuries of human behavior pass through his archive. He knew what people do with philosophies that are convenient for them. And maybe, this is speculation, but maybe this is why the Tao Te Ching is written the way it is. So slippery. so paradoxical, so resistant to being pinned down, because any philosophy simple enough to be used as an excuse isn't wisdom. It's ideology. The Tao Te Ching resists being used. Every time you think you've grasped it, it shifts. Every time you think you've found the rule, it tells you there is no rule. Every time you find the comfortable interpretation, another verse appears to make you uncomfortable again. Verse 81, the last verse, ends like this. The sage does not compete, and therefore no one can compete with him. Because after 80 verses of telling us not to strive, not to compete, not to force, he ends with a description of invincibility. The one who doesn't compete cannot be beaten. Because you can only lose to someone who has entered the same game as you, and the sage has stepped out of the game entirely. Is this wisdom, or is it a different kind of dominance? Is refusing to play a form of freedom, or is it the ultimate power move? Where is the line? Honestly, I don't know. Neither did Laozi, and I think that's the most honest thing about the Tao Te Ching. It doesn't pretend to know, it doesn't offer a system, it doesn't give you a checklist for becoming a sage. It gives you 81 problems to sit with, and trusts that the sitting will eventually do more than any answer could. The river already moving. You're getting tired now. Maybe you've been tired for a while. Let your eyes close if they want to. Let the voice become something that moves through you, rather than something you need to follow. I want to ask you something, not a difficult question, a gentle one. Is there something in your life right now that you've been forcing, a relationship you've been trying to fix, through effort, through talking, through pushing, a career path you've been grinding toward through sheer will, a version of yourself you've been attempting to build through discipline and control? What would it look like to stop forcing it, not to give up, not to abandon it, not to stop caring? But to stop gripping, to open your hand. Water doesn't hold its shape by gripping, it holds its nature by releasing. It flows because it doesn't insist on flowing in any particular direction. It simply finds the path that's already there. What is the path that's already there in your life? Not the path you planned, not the path you're supposed to want, not the path that would make sense to explain to others, the path that the current is already pulling you toward. Laozi would say, you probably already know what it is. You've probably known for longer than you want to admit. You've just been too busy doing other things to follow it. There's a verse in the Tao Te Ching, verse 16, that I keep returning to. Return to the root is called stillness. Return to the one's destiny is called the eternal. Knowing the eternal is called enlightenment. Return to the root. What is your root? Not your achievements, not your story, not your carefully constructed identity. The thing underneath all of that, the thing that was there before you decided who you were going to be. ZHUANGZI asked, were you the man who dreamed of being a butterfly, or the butterfly who is now dreaming of being a man? And tonight, at the edge of sleep, maybe the question shifts a little. Maybe it's not about which one is real. Maybe it's about noticing that the one asking the question is still here, is still watching, is still present, regardless of what form it's taking. That presence, that quiet, watching, continuous presence, the Taoists would say, that is the Tao. That is the part of you that has never needed to do anything, that has never been threatened by inaction or failure or uncertainty. That part has always simply been, and it will be. After the thoughts stop, after the plans dissolve, after the identity relaxes, it will still be here, in the valley, in the empty space, waiting, like water, for what comes next. The paradox we live in. Let me be honest with you about something before we close. The Tao Te Ching, this beautiful, ancient, infuriating text, was probably not written in a single night by an old man on a buffalo. Most scholars now believe it was compiled gradually, over generations, by multiple authors in the turbulent centuries of the Warring States period. Laozi himself may be a mythological figure, a composite, a symbol more than a historical person. And somehow, this doesn't make it less true. Because what the text represents, whatever its origin, is the accumulated observation of people who watched their world with extraordinary patience, who watched how empires that expanded too fast collapsed, who watched how the people who seemed to have the least control often had the deepest peace, who watched how the most powerful river in the landscape was the one that never fought the terrain, and who tried, imperfectly, paradoxically, beautifully, to put that observation into words. The Tao Te Ching is not a philosophy of certainty. It is a philosophy of attention. It does not tell you what to do. It asks you to pay attention to what's already happening, to notice where you are forcing, to feel where the current is, to ask honestly whether your effort is making things better or just making you feel like you're doing something. And sometimes, and this is the part that takes real courage, to stop, to let the situation breathe, to trust that the universe does not need your intervention. And sometimes, this is the other part that takes real courage, to act anyway, to pick up the knife, even though it will dull, to speak, even though your voice might not change anything, to stay in the world even when withdrawal feels holier. Wu Wei is not a rule, it's a question you have to ask fresh in every moment. Is this force necessary? Is this effort serving what's actually here, or serving my need to feel useful? Is my non-action wisdom or comfort? Is my action clarity or ego? These are not questions with permanent answers. They require you to keep showing up, keep paying attention, keep being honest with yourself, which is, the Taoists would say, the only practice that matters. Outrow, sleep now. The universe is very old, older than anything we have words for. For most of its existence, the vast, incomprehensible majority of the 13+ billion years since whatever it was that started all of this, there were no humans to name it, to study it, to worry about whether they were doing enough. The stars burned, galaxies drifted through the dark, nebulae slowly collapsed into new suns, life arose and died, and arose again in forms we'll never know. And none of it tried, none of it forced. It simply unfolded. And here you are, at the end of a long day, at the end of this long, strange, philosophical night. And for this moment, just this moment, you don't need to try either. You don't need to solve anything. You don't need to answer the hard questions we sat with tonight. You don't need to figure out whether your non-action is wisdom or avoidance. You don't need to decide who you are or what you want or where you're going. The Tao will still be there in the morning. The river will still be moving. The valley will still be empty and receptive and full of quiet potential. All you have to do right now, the only thing, is let go. Let your thoughts drift like clouds that don't need to go anywhere in particular. Let your breath find its own rhythm, deep and slow and effortless. Let your body become heavy and warm. Let your mind become like the valley, empty, spacious, at rest. And somewhere in the space between thinking and not thinking, in the pause between one breath and the next, maybe you'll feel it. The thing that doesn't need to be doing anything, that is already home, that has always been home, the way that can't be named, but can be felt, right here, right now. Sleep well.